I'm Professor Steve Zipperstein, Director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I want to welcome you to our very important webinar today, in which we are commemorating the 30th anniversary today, November the 4th, the 30th anniversary of the tragic, horrific assassination of former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. We have an incredibly distinguished guest today to talk to us about Rabin's life, his legacy, and the reverberations of the assassination today. Before I introduce our guest, I want to thank our UCLA co-sponsors, the Center for Middle East Development at UCLA, the UCLA Departments of History and Public Policy. And with that, let's begin. Our guest today is Ambassador Professor Itamar Rabinovich, a Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History and former President of Tel Aviv University. He is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States of America, and he served as Israel's chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s. He's the president of the Don David Foundation and president emeritus and counselor of the Israel Institute in both Washington, D.C. and Tel Aviv, and a distinguished fellow of the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. Professor Rabinovich has written many, many books, the most recent of which published by Brookings Press in 2023, Middle Eastern Maze. But the one that I want to mention was published in 2016 by Yale University Press. It is Professor Rabinovich's definitive biography of the life of Yitzhak Rabin. The book translated into 7 languages and the winner of the 2017 Washington Institute Gold Medal and the 2020 President and Prime Minister of Israel Book Prize. Professor Rabinovich has held many academic positions at many distinguished universities around the world and the United States. He's the recipient of many honors from many countries around the world, including being named a commander of the Order of the Palme Académique by the government of France, the winner of the Korn Gerstemann Prize for contributions to peace in the Middle East. Professor Rabinovich, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us on this very, very sad day. I'll turn the floor over to you. Audience, please think of your questions, type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I'll get to as many of them as I can during the Q&A portion of our webinar. Professor Rabinovich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Zipperstein, or Steve, as I know you better. You mentioned some of my former positions. One of the most important former position was that of a doctoral student at UCLA, from where I got my PhD and spent wonderful 2.5 years and got very good Middle Eastern education. So the biography of Yitzhak Rabin that I published in 2016 was titled Yitzhak Rabin, Soldier, Leader, Statesman. Originally, I thought of the title Native Son because in many respects, the life of Yitzhak Rabin were the quintessential life of an Israeli Sabra born in the 1920s in mandatory Palestine, growing up in Tel Aviv, going to an agricultural school in the Galilee, then volunteering to the elite unit of the pre-state military units of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Palmach, where he became deputy to the legendary commander Yigal Allon, was with Yigal Allon during the War of Independence. He fought on the road to Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, then in the Negev, was a senior distinguished officer in the IDF, and decided to stay in the IDF. As he wrote in his memoirs, the IDF was in terms of equipment, training and so forth, in bad shape during the War of Independence, and he vowed that he will devote the next phase of his life to making sure that this would not happen again. And indeed, he was promoted to general. He was deputy chief of staff, then became chief of staff, and as such, he deserved the credit for building and preparing the IDF for the great victory of 1967, where he shared the glory with Moshe Dayan was then Minister of Defense. So that's the soldier part of it. Then, not necessarily as a leader in preparation for political leadership, Rabin went to see Prime Minister Eshkol and asked him, so what would you like to do now? And Rabin, who wanted to start a political career, told the surprised Prime Minister, I want to be ambassador in Washington. Eshkol was a bit puzzled because Rabin was not your typical ambassador, but he said yes. Rabin went to Washington and was a great ambassador. He built a very close relationship with Henry Kissinger, who was then the National Security Advisor and eventually Secretary of State. Through him, a very good working relationship with President Nixon, and he obtained many achievements for the State of Israel as ambassador. And in 1973, ended his term, came back and prepared to enter a political life. He was not a natural politician. Rabin was not the kind of person who wanted to, as they say in Americanese, kiss babies, or go to weddings, as politicians who have to go through primaries do. But reluctant as he was, he did some of what he needed to do as a politician. What was not planned was that we had the debacle of 1973. Golda Meir's government had to resign. She and Moshe Dayan left. Labour Party had to choose another prime minister. There was a competition between Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. Rabin won 60-40 and became prime minister. The first term, 1973 to 1977, the main achievement, the interim agreement with Egypt in 1975 that laid the foundation for Camp David 2 years later in 77, and the peace agreement in 1979. But Rabin himself had to resign in 1977 over a minor scandal. When you look at today's politics in Israel and around the world, it really was minor. He and his wife had a bank account in Washington that they did not close when they left the embassy, but he resigned. In the event, he did not interfere with his future career. People did not take it seriously. And he rebuilt his political position in the 1980s as Minister of Defense. This was a very important formative in constructing his leadership. He was a very effective Minister of Defense. He became Mr. National Security to the Israeli public. And some of his qualities that he became famous for, the honesty, the directness, sometimes even bluntness, came through during these years. For instance, in those years were the years in which we remained in Lebanon after the 1982 war, and Israel suffered casualties in South Lebanon practically every month. And let's say 4 soldiers would be killed. Rabin would go on television on a Friday night special broadcast. He would look the audience in the eyes and say, I am the Minister of Defense. I am responsible. And again, not your typical conduct for politicians or political leaders, either in my country or in your country, but that was Rabin. That was very engaging. And he therefore built his credibility with the Israeli public as a very effective Minister of Defense. He built his authority with the Israeli public. And in 1992, the center of the Labour Party came to the conclusion that Shimon Peres was unable to defeat the Likud party. He failed in a number of elections, and they voted for Rabin. Rabin became the candidate, ran in the 1992 parliamentary elections, and became prime minister. And it is here that we make the transition from a leader to statesman. Rabin came into office with a conviction that it could not be just a regular term. He was not re-elected 15 years after losing power, given a rare chance by Providence to come back, just to call it enjoy the trappings of power in Israel. If you can enjoy the trappings of power in Israel, he had to accomplish something. And what he promised the Israeli public in his inaugural speech as elected prime minister was, I'm here to change the order of priorities of the state of Israel. I'm going to fix the relationship with the United States that deteriorated under the Likud government. I'm going to detach ourselves from investing in the settlement project in the West Bank and Gaza. And I'm going to rearrange or rebuild Israel's position in the region. What did he mean by that? And Rabin identified the major threat to Israel's national security in the East, Iran and Iraq. This was still Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But he identified the Iranian threat then, early on, by 1992. And in order to confront these dual threats from Iraq and Iran, he determined to fix Israel's relationship with its immediate neighbors, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinians. There actually was a peace process in place. This is the Madrid process that was launched by the Bush-Baker administration after the first Gulf War, and it did not move much since its inception, but Rabin decided to put a new life into the peace process, and indeed he did put a new life into the peace process. A few words about his preferences. Clearly, Jordan and Lebanon were not candidates for making a first agreement. These were weak states that could not take the punishment for being the first. Syria and the Palestinians could do. Between Syria and the Palestinians, he preferred Syria. His policy was Syria first policy. But as it turned out, it was very difficult to make a deal with Syria because Syria was led by Hafez al-Assad, a very stubborn man, who said, I'm willing to make peace, but I will tell you what I mean by peace only after you commit to full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. And our response, I was the head of the delegation to the negotiations, was you do not begin a negotiation with the bottom line, you begin it with the first line, and the first line, we need to talk about what is peace and what is security. So we went at it back and forth, but there was no breakthrough. At the same time, the Oslo Channel opened, the Israeli negotiation with the PLO. It was not begun by Rabin, it was begun by Yossi Beil and Shimon Peres, but Rabin was informed and he gave them a blessing and continued to monitor that relationship. And in August 1993, it was ready to be signed. Rabin made yet another valiant attempt to see whether a deal could be made with Syria. The response from Syria was disappointing, and so he decided to go to Oslo, and the peace process of the mid-90s was built on a Palestinian base. So what was accomplished during Rabin's first term? The Oslo Accords. They are controversial in Israel, and we'll speak a bit about what they mean today, later. Secondly, peace with Jordan, and the normalization de facto with several Arab countries. It looked like the prospect of full peace or almost a full peace or a full settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict was around the corner. But there were obstacles, there were opponents. On the other side, Iran, Syria was not happy. and the radical Palestinian organization headed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They perpetrated massive terrorist acts inside Israel and eroded Israeli public support for the process, made Oslo controversial. And on the Israeli side, the settlers, the extreme right wing, were dead set against it. For the settlers and people of the radical right wing in Israel, land took first place. Say the commitment to the quote-unquote land of Israel preceded commitment to the people of Israel. Land, in a way, became sacred, and giving up any part of the land of Israel was seen as a grave error, and the incitement expanded against Rabin and against the Oslo process. And after the signing of the complementary agreement of Oslo II in September 1995, the incitement intensified, became very, very massive, very ugly, and Rabin personally was vilified in demonstrations and in riots. You could see they were burning Rabin's image. Rabin was shown either as Hitler or dressed up as an Arab. It really was a very ugly period. And of course, there was a killer, would-be killer, Yigal Amir, a radical student at Bar-Ilan University, who determined that the only way to stop the process was to assassinate Rabin, and he prepared for it, and was looking for an opportunity, and the opportunity came to him at a peace rally held in Tel Aviv in November, on that fateful day. He waited. There was again a miserable security debacle. In fact, there was an area that was ironically called the sterile area. Now I can tell you and our audience, after the Oklahoma blast, I was ambassador. When I used to go to Capitol Hill to see a congressman or a senator, my car could park for about 4 seconds before 2 policemen were on it and sending it away. This was not the situation in the municipal square in Tel Aviv. The killer was basically allowed to hang around. Interesting point. Shimon Peres left the podium of the rally a couple of minutes before Yitzhak Rabin. There is a video of the assassination filmed from across the street by an amateur, and you can see Shimon Peres going down the stairs and passing by Yigal Amir, who is sitting there, and you could see the expression on Yigal Amir's face, sort of asking himself, should I kill Peres or should I not? And convincing himself that that was not the point. The only one who could make Oslo work was Rabin, not Peres, because he had the will and the standing with the Israeli public. So he lets Peres go by. Rabin comes by. He shot a few shots in his back. Rabin didn't die instantly, but died in hospital a few minutes later. So we had that tragic assassination. Now, looking back 30 years, what impact did it have? At the time, people said this is the death of the peace process. Rabin was depicted as the only leader who wanted to do it and could do it. I disagree with that judgment. Yes, it hindered the peace process. Netanyahu paid lip service to Oslo, and he said he would keep it, but in fact, he continued to undermine it. But then Netanyahu lost power in 1999, and Ehud Barak came in, and Ehud Barak himself and Ehud Olmert a few years later negotiated very seriously both with Syria and the Palestinians, put very significant proposals on the table to both. There was the second Camp David conference with Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat, that failed. Again, famously, Ehud Olmert in 2008 negotiated with Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, put a far-reaching proposal on the table, offering 96% of the West Bank, a territorial swap, and solution with regard to Jerusalem. And Abu Mazen did not take it. If you read Condoleezza Rice's memoirs, she said that she was surprised twice. Once when she saw what Olmert was putting on the table, and second time when Abu Mazen didn't take it. So you cannot. And then, of course, Sharon dismantled the settlements in Gaza and departed from Gaza in 2005. So you cannot say that the peace process did not continue. It ended with the ultimate failure of the Palestinian negotiations during the period of Obama, and with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, when a process of mediation between the U.S. and Israel came to an end. So the impact of the assassination was not so much on the peace process. Where did it have massive repercussions? In Israel's domestic politics. Look at the government that is in power now. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, led the opposition to the Oslo Accords and led the incitement. He did not. He was careful not to incite directly against Rabin, his body and life. But other than that, he engaged in a lot of incitement, and famously, there's footage of him marching in a procession in a town called Ra'anana, north of Tel Aviv, and behind him, maybe 20 yards behind him, there's a coffin, and there is a hanging rope. What did it mean? He claims that he never saw them, but there he was. And in a very ugly rally in Zion Square in Jerusalem, very ugly, he was on the podium. The moderately good leaders who were there, Dan Meridor, Benny Begin, David Levy, walked away. They couldn't take the incitement and the atmosphere in the audience, but he went on. So has been the prime minister for quite a while. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist politician, in 1995, when Rabin paid a visit to a place called the Wingate Institute, he had an American car with an emblem on the hood. Ben-Gvir managed to break the emblem, held the emblem in his hand and said, "We got to the car, we'll get to you." Okay. He's now the Minister of National Security in charge of the police. So that shows to you in a nutshell where we went 30 years later. There were several mistakes committed by the Israeli government with Rabin's successors after the assassination in November 1995 and in the coming month. It was a mistake not to hold the elections right away, but Shimon Peres didn't want to be elected as Rabin's avenger, but on his own. And more importantly, the government chose to try to go for unity in the country, and not to go after the inciters, not to go after the West Bank rabbis who incited and who sanctioned the assassination. And that was a mistake. People who incited for the assassination, people who sanctioned the assassinated, should have been prosecuted and punished at the time. This was not done. Unity, whatever unity was achieved at the time, was false, not a true unity. And the result is that over time, right wing and the extreme right wing took over. Netanyahu has drifted himself more and more to the right. Netanyahu of 2025 is not Netanyahu of 1996. And of course, the two coalition partners, I mentioned Ben-Gvir, and we have Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionism, which basically has become the settlers' party, and is a party that wants to annex the West Bank and to deny the inhabitants citizenship in order to presumably keep the Israeli demographic, the Jewish demographic majority. This is very much the agenda of the current government, very far from Oslo. Is something left of Oslo itself? Definitely yes. There is a Palestinian Authority. It is not independent, it is autonomous. It administers and governs most of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. And oftentimes when I'm discussing or debating with a critic of Oslo, verifies the agreement, I say, well, do you really want to go back to Nablus and Ramallah and Hebron and collect the garbage and manage the educational and health systems? Well, the answer, if not explicit, is basically no. But that of course is not a long-term solution. At some point, something more significant will have to be done. Now, Rabin is commemorated. There are a number of major events. There is a memorial near the grave. There is an event in the Knesset. Normally, the Prime Minister used to come to the memorial event in the cemetery. This year, Netanyahu decided not to come. There was no grief in the Rabin family, but this year he did not come. His presence there was awkward because people in their family and Rabin's admirers remember very well the role played by Netanyahu prior to the assassination. There are many places named after Rabin, hospital, highways, streets, and of course the Rabin Center, which is the equivalent of a presidential library, which engages full-time in commemorating Rabin, but also in educating soldiers and visitors about the history of Israel as seen through the perspective of Rabin. So the 30th anniversary of the assassination was a major event in the country, a major rally in Tel Aviv, several other events. The media devote a lot of time and attention to the event. People discuss and debate. People who disagreed with Rabin at the time or disagree with his the course that he outlined today are critical, but people can denounce the assassination and criticize the policy. That's fine. The major rally held in Tel Aviv Saturday night was pretty much several of the opposition leaders spoke, and it seemed like the first round in the election campaign of 2026, which I hope will take, the elections will take place. There are several question marks about that. So this election is going to be a very critical election. People of Israel will have to vote in a way twice, once on foreign national security policy, what to do about the Palestinian issue, what to do about Gaza and the West Bank. And they'll have to vote on Israel's domestic way, because the current government began what they call a judicial reform, which we call, the critics of the policy called judicial coup, trying to build a more authoritarian form of government to weaken or remove the gatekeepers. You who live in the States are familiar with it. So are the citizens of European countries like Hungary and Poland. And so it arrived in Israel, and the voters will have to vote on these two issues. It's going to be a crucial election. I'm sure that during the election campaign, Rabin's name and Rabin's legacy will be invoked many, many times. So let me stop here, and I'd be very happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rabinovich, for that really incredible summary of Rabin's life, weaving in the history of the country. You mentioned the Rabin Center, the wonderful museum and teaching center on Chaim Lebanon Street next to Tel Aviv University. It's the one place I tell all first-time visitors to Israel to go first, to get very, very good introduction to Rabin's life and to the history of the country. I want to thank our audience. We have a number of superb questions. I'll ask a few of them. You can answer them to whatever extent you're comfortable with, Ambassador. We have a question from a member of the audience who is interested in your view on how Rabin's relations with European leaders contrast with the current government's relations with European leaders. So not America, but European leaders. Second, there's a question whether or not, as a result of the elections for next year, October 2026, that you just mentioned, if there is a change of government in Israel as a result of those elections, do you see any chances for progress toward the two-state solution? And then finally, a question from a member of the audience asking you to speculate, with all due respect, if Rabin had been prime minister on October 7, 2023, how would the country have responded as compared to how it responded under Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Yeah.
So thank you to the audience. Keep them coming. If we have time, we'll take a few more questions for Ambassador Rabinovich.
Okay. So first question about the European, Rabin and European leaders. Rabin had an American orientation. He always thought that Israel's main chance lay with the United States. He did not neglect Europe, and he, of course, had good relations, invested efforts in the relationship with Great Britain, France, Germany, Israel's main relationships in Europe, but the emphasis was on the United States. And this was one of the early differences between him and his great rival Shimon Peres, because Shimon Peres began with the European orientation, Germany and France, and Rabin had an American orientation. But anyway, that's with regard to that question. Second question about, well, let's say that there is a change of government and the center-left will form the next government after the elections that hopefully will take place in 2026. I'm not sure that they will have the power to take major steps in the direction of the Palestinians. It's probably going to be, they have a narrow majority. There would be, again, very strong opposition, maybe even violent opposition to these steps. They may not have requisite political power to do that, but they would start by normalizing our life, normalizing our political life, canceling the judicial coup or reform. And with regard to the Palestinians, whatever try to make the deal made with regard to Gaza, the three phases work. And secondly, stop the harassment of the Palestinians in the West Bank by the settlers who are trying to evict Palestinians in the West Bank and lead eventually to a de facto annexation to Israel. This, I'm sure, a center-left government will stop. Whether it would have the necessary political power to come to a full-fledged solution or settlement of the Palestinian problem, I'm not so sure. Now, with regard to Gaza, I can firmly state it's not that Rabin would have responded differently to October 7. October 7 would not have happened. I hope that there will be a national commission of inquiry that will seriously examine the road to October 7. One thing is clear: the government policy in the years preceding October 7 was to support Hamas over the Palestinian Authority, and of course, most prominently to allow Qatar to send money to Hamas. The money was not expended by Hamas on development, but on preparing for October 7. And secondly, I think the debacle of October 7 itself would not have happened because Rabin was a very careful Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. He always checked, he always verified, and the lights indicating that danger was there lit up earlier. They were ignored, both by the professionals and by the political level. Since I worked very closely with Rabin and saw how attentive he was to security issues, how he had the overview, but he also went into details and checked and double checked, I think it would not have happened in the first place.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of wonderful questions. Thank you to the audience for them. I don't have time to ask all of them, but I'll ask a few. One question is about Oslo. In hindsight, some people say that Oslo, both the Declaration of Principles and the interim agreement, should have specified Palestinian statehood as the final outcome. As you know, neither agreement contains any provision for Palestinian statehood. Instead, there are a list of so-called permanent status issues, Jerusalem border security, etc., that were left to final negotiation, but there was no upfront agreement that Palestinian statehood would be the end result. And some people now in 2025 look back and say that was a mistake. We'd like to have your commentary about that. Another question is asking about how Rabin felt about the Palestinian leaders with whom he interacted, both Arafat and Abu Mazen, others. I'm reminded of a famous scene on the White House lawn in 1993, where it seemed that President Clinton almost forced Rabin into the handshake with Arafat. How did Rabin feel about Arafat? How did he feel about Abu Mazen? And for that matter, if I can add to the question, how did Rabin feel about some of the American interlocutors, whether President Clinton, another famous person from Los Angeles, Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, who practiced law here in Los Angeles for many years? How did Rabin feel about all these various people that he was dealing with, both on the Palestinian and the American side? And if you want to expand it to any other Arab leaders, that would be great as well. And then finally, a very interesting question from one of our audience members, asking you to opine regarding the possibility, not just of, say, Saudi Arabia maybe joining the Abraham Accords or maybe stopping short, but agreeing to some kind of quasi-normalization above the surface as opposed to sub rosa. But what about a broader regional modus vivendi accommodation, obviously not including Iran, but whereby Israel and the surrounding Sunni states en masse would enter into some kind of accommodation? Is that possible? Is that doable? So those are the questions for this round, and if we have time, we'll do one more.
Okay. So about Oslo. Oslo was, of course, not a perfect agreement, but one has to bear in mind, it was, even Oslo as such was shocking to the Israeli public. I mean, Rabin himself, previous years, vilified Arafat and the PLO, and here he was making a deal with them and bringing Arafat back from exile in Tunis to Gaza and the West Bank, and in a way entrusting part of Israeli security into their hands, and of course indicating that we are willing to give up, if not the whole West Bank, then parts of the West Bank, which for many Israelis and Jews is actually the original biblical homeland. So that was very radical. So therefore, the idea was let's begin with a 5-year interim period, and let the parties get used to one another. Let them find ways of working with one another. Also, in a way, let's test the other side whether a peaceful relationship is workable. And the results were mixed. And it's an open question where a negotiation between Rabin should have been re-elected in '96 and Arafat would be. I'm not sure that it would have produced an agreement. Arafat, by the way, respected Rabin very much, and perhaps was willing to accept from him elements that he would not accept from another Israeli leader. But I'm not sure that it would have worked out. Rabin himself, in the last speech in the Knesset just before the assassination, spoke about the Palestinian entity less than a state. But it doesn't mean that this is what he really thought, but he had to negotiate. And the main asset in the negotiations was the agreement to statehood. Why would he give it away prior to the negotiation? Would not have been a smart negotiating technique. So there we are, in a less than perfect agreement, but perhaps the best that could be achieved at the time. So that, with regard to that question, can you remind me of?
Yes, Rabin's view of Abu Mazen, Arafat, maybe the Americans.
Yeah. Okay. So Rabin began with a very skeptical view of Arafat. I think it improved. I mean, Arafat was not easy to trust. I mean, he was say not the most trustworthy, honorable, straightforward leader in the world, but he was the only Palestinian leader who could deliver. So, and you know, they grew to find ways of working with one another. It was, call it an okay relationship with the Americans. Of course, wonderful friendship, almost love relationship between Rabin and Clinton. Clinton saw in Rabin an elder figure. As if I go into cheap psychoanalysis, somebody who grew up without a father, it was a bit of a father figure, a military hero to somebody who didn't serve in the military. And he liked the basic qualities of Rabin, the honesty, the bluntness, the putting things as they were. You know exactly where you stood with him. Not the case with all other Israeli political leaders. And Rabin admired in Clinton the warm personality, the openness, the natural charisma, the profound understanding of politics. So they met once before, but the first working meeting was in March 1993. I was a note taker in the meeting, and you could see it was almost love at second sight. So that was with Clinton. Less so with Christopher. It was a reasonable working relationship, but not much more than that. And of course, there were many senators, congressmen, generals that Rabin knew from earlier incarnations. He was in his element dealing with American leaders, politicians, businessmen, and so forth. He was very comfortable doing that. It was for me a unique experience to be the ambassador of a former ambassador in Washington who knew what he took to be an effective ambassador in Washington. So it was the second. The third question, if you...
No, that was really the three questions. Let me ask you one of my own questions. And members of the audience, I have paraphrased some of your questions. I know a couple of you are not happy that I did not read them verbatim, but in the interest of time, I've paraphrased them with your kind permission. You mentioned the rivalry between Peres and Rabin. You told me a wonderful story years ago, Ambassador, about the telephone booth in the Ve'avivim. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing that with the audience. But then from that, I have a more serious question. Would it be fair to say in some ways that the Labor Party also died 30 years ago, where the beginning of the death of the Labor Party occurred with the assassination, the
Yeah,
vaunted, famous Labor Party in Israel?
yeah. Okay, so the rivalry between Rabin and Peres went back into the 1950s when Peres was very close to founding father Ben-Gurion, was Director General of the Ministry of Defense and then Deputy Minister of Defense. And Rabin was a senior Israeli general, candidate for Chief of Staff. Peres did not support that, let's put it that way. Peres had, I mentioned before, the European orientation. Rabin had the American interpretation. They were, in a way, rivals. And of course, they competed for the leadership after the resignation of Golda Meir. Rabin won 60-40, and he felt that, given the fact that Peres had 40% support, he had to give him a major portfolio and gave him the Ministry of Defense. And that relationship, the enmity between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, bedeviled Rabin and cast a shadow over his first term as Prime Minister. Back in, further in 1992, when Rabin replaced Peres as leader of the party and won the elections, he felt that he had to give him a major portfolio, gave him the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There was not the kind of bitter, open enmity and rivalry of the first term, but there was a rivalry. I was, in a way, in an unhappy position where, as negotiator with Syria, I reported to Rabin. As ambassador to Washington, I reported both to him and to Peres, and I had to walk a tightrope, which I happily survived, but it was not always very easy. About the Labour Party, the Labour Party did not die as a result of the assassination. It died because it lost its way and purpose. It was the party that played a major role in establishing and building the state. It was a social democratic party, and it did not connect to what we call the second Israel, the immigrants from Muslim countries. They were not happy with the way they were integrated in the 1950s, sent to development towns, and so forth and so forth. There is a bitterness in that segment of the population against the people who accepted them, and maybe not always so gracefully. And they don't vote for the Labour. They vote for Likud or for other parties. Same with Shas, the North African Orthodox party. And Labour had to find a new message in order to justify its existence. It did not have great leadership. After Peres himself moved together with Sharon to another party. And it was a big mistake on the part of the leaders of two small parties, in Labour and Meretz, the left-wing party, not to run together in the 2022 elections. It cost, it exacted a high price. And now Labour has a very attractive leader, General Yair Golan, who's a very eloquent speaker and forceful personality. It's called now the Democrats, not the Labour Party. It's not going to win an election at this point. He may, according to public opinion polls, will end up with somewhere between 10 and 14 members of Knesset, which is not bad, and he could, of course, join a coalition and be a major partner in a coalition. So it now has a second life in a way, but the historic Labour Party is dead and gone.
Okay. Since we have you, there are a number of questions from our audience about the two-state solution, both now as well as one member of the audience asking, was Arafat really serious about two states, or was Oslo just sort of a holding action to give time to try to eliminate Israel as called for in the original PLO Charter of 1964? And the way that I'd like to approach all these questions from our audience would be, if you don't mind, Ambassador, to ask you to comment on the Trump 20-point plan. Obviously, the first element of the plan, the release of the final 20 living Israelis in exchange for cessation of hostilities, occurred. The ceasefire shaky, Hamas holding onto power, Hamas slow rolling the release of the deceased Israeli hostages. What do you think are the prospects for the 20-point plan? Is this the beginning of maybe some hope, a new Oslo, progress, or something else? If you can enlighten us about that, we would all
Sure.
very much appreciate it.
Okay. Two-state solution. I am for a two-state solution. Practically not tomorrow morning. I think we need to renew negotiations with the Palestinian Authority with the prospect of statehood on the table. Very serious Palestinian leaders that I speak to tell me honestly, in four eyes, we're not ready. The Palestinian Authority needs to reform in order to be capable of establishing and running a state. There's no point in establishing another failed state in the Middle East. So, but we have to clearly point a direction. If this begins, namely a negotiation, such a negotiation with the Palestinian Authority, the Saudis, I think, will normalize, and this would be a stepping stone towards a larger settlement or construction of a moderate pro-Western coalition in the Middle East. So I very much hope that this will happen. As to Arafat, and in a way also Abu Mazen, Arafat, I think, was still hoping for something quote unquote better than a two-state solution from his perspective. And you know, a Palestinian leader once, a serious one, told me once, listen, time is on our side. Make your deal now, because you look at the numbers and there's nothing wrong with our intellects, and at some point we'll catch up with you. So make your deal now. So the sense that time is on the side of the Arabs and the Palestinians is there as a hindrance to making the deal now. Abu Mazen himself, I think, cannot overcome the fact that he is a refugee from Safed. And we come now to a very important point. What Israelis want to see more than anything else in an agreement with the Palestinian partner is finality. And it has to be stated very clear that this is it, no more claims, no right of return, and no other claims. Very difficult mentally, emotionally, for Abu Mazen to sign no more claims. It may have to be a leader from another generation who could possibly do that. Now, with regard to the Trump plan, there are three phases here. The first phase is done. It's fragile, but it's done very effectively. And he deserves a lot of credit. He and his team deserve a lot of credit for that. The transition to a second phase, the construction of a multinational force, construction of an administrative political structure to govern and administer Gaza, is going to be very difficult. Hamas is there. It's building up daily. It will fight. It will not want to disarm. And it will take a great deal of resolve and willingness on the part of those who send the peacekeepers to take casualties. Not very likely that many countries would be willing to do that. So that's problematic, not impossible, but problematic. I think that Trump is also engaged in a third phase. Said, on the basis of all of this, let's try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian question and build the kind of regional bloc that I mentioned before. And let's here look at something very interesting. Trump mentioned the other day the name of Marwan Barghouti. the Palestinian, the Fatah leader, who has been in Israeli jail for a long time for very serious offenses committed during the Second Intifada. And quite a few people speculate that he would be, quote unquote, the Palestinian Nelson Mandela. Maybe yes, maybe no, but how come Trump would mention his name? He's not exactly an expert on Palestinian politics. My conclusion is that in his circle, they are discussing a final status agreement, and the name of Marwan Barghouti came up as a successor to Abu Mazen. So I hope that Trump, who is famously impatient, will gather up the patience to stay with the process and make it work.
And would be very interesting to see if Yitzhak Rabin were still alive, how he and Trump would get along as compared to Rabin and Clinton. I can only imagine what that would be
Yeah,
like.
very different personalities. Yeah.
Well, Ambassador Rabinovich, thank you so much for being so generous with your time with our audience. This evening, your time, it's already 8:30 p.m. in Tel Aviv. Thank you to our audience for your superb questions. Please check our website, UCLA Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, for our upcoming programs, both in-person events here at UCLA. We have some important film screenings and other events coming up in the next few weeks, some very important in-person events in the winter quarter, as well as video recordings of our most recent events the last few weeks. I want to thank our UCLA co-sponsors again, the Center for Middle East Development, the Departments of History and Public Policy. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and rest of the week. Thank you, Ambassador, again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure being with you.